Hello. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Sandra, and today I'm here today to share with you the story of my son Clifton. On July 20th, 2012, my son Clifton was life-flighted from a hospital in Lake Jackson, Texas, to Children's Memorial Hermann in Houston, Texas, and admitted into CM8, Children's Memorial Hermann, on a traumatic brain injury that he suffered due to physical abuse and neglect at the hands of my ex-husband's girlfriend. Upon his arrival, his brain was severely swollen. The injury to his brain was so severe that one of the hemispheres had literally shifted over the medial line into the other space of his skull. Further, he could not regulate any of his blood pressure or electrolyte levels at this point, and he was given a ventilator to help regulate his breathing, as well as a feeding tube to help give him nutrients. He was on 5 different blood pressure medications at this point, and he was given several blood transfusions. Based on his condition, the doctors had given him less than 1% chance to live and survive the first night of his stay. So when they were discussing with me about what we were going to do for his treatment, they had informed me that they were going to place a do not resuscitate order on his chart. I did not want them to put a DNR on him, but when I've contested it, the doctors had told me, well, they're not asking for my permission to do that. They're just going to do it because they feel like it's in his best interest, despite the fact that I did not want to do that. So believing that he was not going to make it, because the odds were very slim, I spent a lot of time with my son. I played his favorite movies. He loved How to Train Your Dragon. He loved dragons. Thomas the Train. Just read him Bible stories and played his favorite music, from the David Crowder Band to the Afters, anything that I could do to spend time with him. However, I ended up falling asleep, and I woke up panicked thinking that he passed away and I was asleep in his final moments. However, despite the less than the 1% chance odds, he did survive the first night. But it was a long road ahead. He suffered many bodily seizures and was very unresponsive those first few weeks. His pupils and body movements, he wouldn't respond to light or touch. His gag reflexes had stopped working anytime they were inserting or removing tubes. And they had told me that based on this criteria, that the last step was that he would stop breathing and then ultimately die. Like, this was the track that it would take before somebody would die. So they encouraged me to remove him from life support because keeping him on a ventilator was only prolonging his suffering. And I did not want to do that, but they were trying to tell me that if I did, I could turn into something positive and donate his organs, which at that time I did not want to do either. So shortly after having this discussion, I ended up seeing something that I hadn't seen in weeks since arriving to Children's Memorial Hermann. He had finally moved for the first time. A nurse came and cleaned up a lot of the blood that was pooling in his neck area from just the leakage from all the head sutures. And when the nurse came to touch him in the neck to clean up the blood, his right arm had jerked up in the air. And I had not even seen him do any type of movement since we had gotten in there. So for me, this was a sign that my son was alive and that he was responding. Of course, when I brought the doctors in to try to assess what was going on, the doctors had said that no, this is not a sign of a purposeful movement of my son. This is all brainstem reflexes. He's not alive. He's not in there. This is not something intentional from him. Even though this was an asymmetrical movement, and most brainstem reflexes usually occur with a symmetrical movement, so both right or left arm moving at the same time, and that wasn't happening in his case. But anyhow, we were subjected to an ethics committee meeting because they needed to figure out if we needed to cover up his brain, if he needed another brain surgery, because if they were not going to cover up the portion of his brain that was exposed, he would be susceptible to infection and therefore die. But even then, when we had gone through ethics committee meetings, they ultimately decided against the surgery. And said that no, it would be unethical to move forward with any more surgeries. And they didn't explain why. But a couple of days later, I received a call from a hospital staff member saying that they changed their mind and that they were going to go ahead and perform the surgery anyway. Didn't tell me why, they just said they were going to do it, but the only way that they were going to do it is if I consented to a DNR, which was a little confusing because they had already told me that they weren't asking for my permission the first time, so I don't understand why I needed to consent to a DNR in order for them to move forward with the surgery, but nonetheless, I went ahead and consented so we could move forward. So one meeting after another, we ended up having more and more people in attendance. So we ultimately ended up going through like 4 or 5 ethics committee meetings, and the number grew. I think at max we had like up to 30 or 40 people in a room. A lot of people who had never even treated Clifton were in there as well. So, but it became increasingly tense because, you know, he was showing some slight, some improvements over the time. Like I said, he was starting to move asymmetrically a little bit, and his gag reflex would come in and out. And then, so he was responding a little bit more, and which is why we had to go through so many meetings to figure out what were the next steps in his treatment. But when I started asking questions, because I was informed that they had performed a temporal lobectomy his very first night, which is removing a portion of the temporal part of your brain. When I started asking questions during the ethics committee meetings, I was shut down pretty quick from some of the panelists, informing me that I was only invited to come and listen. I was not allowed to speak or ask questions, and if I was going to do so, that I wouldn't be invited back. So after that, any type of questions I had during his treatment in the hospital, doctors and nurses would tell me that they couldn't share that. The only person I was allowed to talk to for any information about his treatment was the PICU doctor in charge. Come to find out, when I wasn't getting answers to my questions, he was on vacation. So the only time I could ever get any type of information was through the ethics committee meetings, but then again, I wasn't allowed to speak. So it was very confusing and very, very tense. But between all the ethics committee meetings, he had undergone multiple brain surgeries and ventilator removal tests. The first time they removed the ventilator, it took him 8 minutes to breathe, which is a really long time, obviously. But then a few days later, when they tried again, he only took 3 minutes to breathe. Again, it's still a very long time to take a breath, but that's much better than 8 minutes. But despite multiple attempts and tests, they could not legally pronounce him brain dead. He kept improving. He actually needed fewer medications. Ultimately, towards the end, he was actually he could regulate his electrolyte levels. He was off of all 5 blood pressure medication, and from what one of the doctors told me, that his body is in tip-top shape, and that he would be a good donor for his organs if we were to remove him from life support. And also he had blood flow to the occipital portion of his brain, which is another reason why they said that they could not legally pronounce him brain dead. But despite all the progress, when we finally went to our final ethics committee meeting, without my consent, they ultimately decided to remove him from life support. I was told that I had 10 days to find another facility who was willing to provide treatment for my son. Obviously, 10 days is not enough when you're trying to find somebody who you've never even talked to convince them why we should continue life-sustaining treatment. So I was told by the social worker to submit a list of hospitals who I would be interested in taking him to. However, I wasn't given any more than that. I wasn't told like what to be looking for when I was researching hospitals or anything like that. So I literally Googled and started with a map and, found local hospitals and then just kept expanding my search after every time they declined all the hospitals on my list. And even when I had submitted hospitals, the social worker would read the list and give me the list back and say they're not going to take him. So even before moving forward to actually have somebody call and discuss my son's treatment, I was already being declined before they even left the room. So again, there's no oversight for me. There's no way to check to see who's actually calling, what's being discussed, or any of that. So during the 10 days, I did begin to see a decrease in the level of my son's care. He would go for several hours without replacing his feeding bag. He would sit in a diaper a soiled diaper for multiple hours. And finally, I got fed up and took it upon myself to change his diaper because, if you leave a child in a soiled diaper, they're susceptible to rashes. And so I took it upon myself to change him, only to have a doctor come in and yell at me that I was not allowed to touch him or to move him. So again, it was very tense. It was very rough. But the 10 days came and went. We did not find another facility. So on July 27th, 2012, in the early afternoon hours, I had watched the ventilator be removed from my son. I was offered the option of giving him morphine to hasten his death, which is something I didn't want to do, but I only had two choices. I was given a choice between death or death. I could either give him a fast death or I could give him a slow death. The doctors had informed me that he was not expected to survive more than 20 minutes off of the ventilator. However, I watched him convulse and suffocate for over an hour. Because I couldn't take watching him suffocate to death, I ultimately decided to administer him morphine, which obviously would depress the respiratory system, and that's how he would die. So seeing him take, one big breath in, he never let one breath out, and ultimately he died in my arms. He had fought a total of 5.5 weeks for his life, and before the hospital made a fateful decision for me and my family without my consent to remove him from all life-sustaining treatment. But I share with you his story today because I believe that there is something to be learned from the last hours of his life. I ask that you please continue to fight for what you believe to be true, that all life, regardless of disease or disability, is to be valued. And we need to be the voice for those who cannot speak, because if we don't speak up for them, then who will?